So this panel is focused on Providence, Rhode Island. So it's become something of the poster child for creative placemaking across the country. It has an amazing reputation, and we thought it would be really interesting to bring some of the folks that helped make that happen in different capacities, all in the same place, to share some behind-the-scenes stories with folks both who are from this community as well as folks from all over the country. So I asked the panelists to actually indulge me, and we're going to do things a little bit differently. So instead of everybody introducing themselves, since this is a fairly small community and everyone knows each other's work, they're going to introduce each other. And they've been all pretty good sports about this. So the questions are, what are the most important things for outsiders to know about blank's, Lynne or Bert's or Clay's work vis-a-vis creative placemaking? And what do you think their greatest strengths are as a creative placemaker? So let's see, who should we pick on first?
I'll get
Clay. Clay wants to go. So Clay is going to introduce Bert.
Figured I'd just get out of the way quickly. Well, it's not easy to introduce Bert necessarily in a succinct manner, but I think it's important to know that this has nothing to do with age. This is the granddaddy of this stuff, everything. Creative placemaking, he was at it, before there was a vocabulary to be used to describe what it is that we do. And I can actually say that for all three of these fellow panelists. I'm the newbie on the scene, or relatively speaking, I guess. And they really created a language around placemaking and the value that the creative sector really has to a livelihood of any space, really, of any community, be it urban or rural. And Bert is probably one of the closer things I've ever had to a mentor in a lot of that. And one of the things that I admired the most was when I first actually met Bert and for a meeting to discuss the Steelyard and some of the ideas that we were kicking around. We met over at the Red Fez, which, if anybody knows, is extremely darkly lit or not lit bar at the time, and kind of just started kicking around ideas. And Bert's reaction to us was one of enthusiasm, excitement, encouragement, and the thing that he left me with and still resonates today is the more the better. And to have a vital creative ecosystem and to have a successful urban environment, it takes activity. And so it wasn't there was not a discouraging word that Bert ever offered me in our interaction at first, well, actually almost since, honestly. He's been nonstop supportive of countless numbers of organizations and individuals in the city. And then in terms of what, I got a little distracted there, but...
So what are the most important things for outsiders to understand about Bert's work in creative placemaking? So they might not even know it's connected to AS220, I
mean, AS220 is has, even in its early stages, as far as I came along, 15 years into its lifespan, before they had expanded into their two new development projects. But it was, basically the model for a creative placemaking engine. It addressed all ages, embraced all ideas, and just kind of oozed with encouragement for people to experiment and play with their creative practice. Is that okay?
Probably good
So,
enough.
Lynne, why don't you tell us who Clay is?
All right.
So what are the most important things for us to know about Clay Rockefeller's work related to creative placemaking, and what are his strengths as a creative placemaker?
So
I was very happy that I was introducing clay because I had the privilege about 3 weeks ago to be at the Steel Yard when the Rudy Bruner Foundation awarded the Steel Yard one of the finalist awards for this year. And we really had a long conversation and got to talk quite a bit about the work of creative placemaking. And so my introduction of Clay starts by saying he graduated from Brown University. We had the good fortune that he saw the potential of Providence 10, 12, 15 years ago and became a member of our community and really became a community organizer. Clay's response to the event that I talked about in the last session around Eagle Square and dislocating all the artists, Clay and his fellow founders really stepped up and saw an opportunity and also saw a moment to serve the community and put together a project that, and they bought a mill building and brought a community that was disenfranchised together again. So when my first and foremost thing about Clay in terms of his creative placemaking is that he's a community organizer and a community builder, and that is what makes Clay so special. Secondly, he is an incredible collaborator and an incredible listener. And I think that, as we all go through the next few days and we're all talking about our projects and what we do and how we get it done and all those things, I think that that's a key piece of being a creative placemaker is listening and responding to the people that you're working with. The Steel Yard is known for its ability to include everyone that works there and lives in the neighborhood and looks out to the neighborhood. When they were renovating the Steel Yard space, they made sure that they heard everyone in the community, not just the artists, not just the creative people, but the people who live there and work there, and that's a very diverse area. So Clay is very intentional in his work. He's very careful in his work. He's very thoughtful in his work, and it's just been a privilege to see everything that's happened at the Steel Yard and how it's contributed to our community and transforming a neighborhood.
So we have two more art spaces, facilities, and lots of programming that goes on within them. Lynne comes at this from a different point, and you've heard her speak some already throughout the day. But Barnaby, I want you to talk about, what are Lynne's strengths in terms of the politicking and building cultural policy within the city of Rhode Island and creative placemaking at that sort of level?
What I think is very interesting about Lynne, but actually about all four people on the stage, is nobody asked any of the four people to do our projects. There weren't any grants, there wasn't any deadline, there wasn't any... these are all entirely self-started projects, and I include Lynne in that, in this sort of vision of what could be the Department of Art, Culture, and Tourism, and the years of thoughtful ambassadorial work, political work, case-making work for every department in the city, and the listening and the discussion and the challenge of explaining both the complexities of the city to the arts community, who gets sometimes impatient over these issues, and doing it all really without the larger mandate in place and without the budget in place to do it. I think people, we heard a little bit about earlier today, about how much has to be accomplished there with, frankly, a 20th of the budget that really should be there. And that's all four of these projects, all four of the projects that are represented by the people on the stage were projects where members of the community sort of came together and had a vision for something far beyond what was happening. And I think, Lynne, you've done that from the inside in a strong case. And you talked about earlier about, with the transition of mayors, building that continuity, building that understanding, as well as being aware of all the strengths of the community and where more things can be done. It was great. I mean, the city owes a great debt of gratitude to you. So thank you.
Okay, so last but not least, Bert, would you tell us about Barnaby's work related to creative placemaking, WaterFire? What do outsiders need to know about that and about his strengths as a creative placemaker?
Just push the Lauren Bacall setting on the EQ for me, please. Barnaby's smart. That's how we say it in Providence. He has more books than the public library, and it's been rumored that he's read them, which I find curious. I think what's really important to understand from my experience and the interactions we've had over the years is that WaterFire is and started as a work of art. That first and foremost, Barnaby, in everything that he does, and the way that he thinks, and the way that he processes, is that of an artist. It's critical to understand that. I think WaterFire is a spectacle. And I mean that in the best sense of the word, and the historic sense of the word. But it is, first and foremost, a work of art. And if I was to tell someone from the outside and to promote their participation in WaterFire, I would talk to them about an aesthetic experience. Okay? I think on occasion, people may forget that. That I don't know if you're still using 3 types of wood in the fire or something, one for smell, popple, and crack, and for endurance, or longevity. That's the level of detail that Barnaby approaches his work at. The music, the smell, so much of what it is, and what may be a kind of intuitive and sort of unconscious response that people are having to WaterFire is not unconscious on the part of the creator. So I think it's really important that people understand Barnaby as an artist, and that WaterFire is an incredibly considered work of art.
Okay, so now is the opportunity where people get to set the record straight if they were misrepresented, and actually not just the person who was introduced, but any people in the panel who say, oh, you didn't say this about Lynne. This is really important for you to know. This is her, the secret of her success. So if you could bring up the first. So we're going to talk about WaterFire first. Here is a picture for those of you who have not experienced. So, I thought Bert hit on some really great points, but what else, if anything, do you want people to know? And it could be why this project came about, who were the key players, and how it happens. Lessons learned on how you got and get it done. Critical benchmarks or policies that helped or hindered. Anything that people can take that wisdom and apply it then to their own unique circumstances.
Well, WaterFire really didn't have an intentional beginning with any sort of vision of where we are now, nearly 20 years later. It was a response to the feeling. I didn't grow up in Rhode Island. I came here from the West Coast. I went to Brown University. I love the community. I love the scale of the community. I love the interaction with the RISD and the arts community in general. And I love the architecture. But I was astonished at the internal negativity of the people I encountered who lived here, who often hadn't traveled recently out of Providence and didn't realize what was here. And one of my wishes was to try to create a work of art that might tip that into a sense of being proud about where people lived. I didn't intend it to be just something we'd be doing for 20 years. I did it as a one-time opportunity to celebrate the 10th anniversary of First Night, where they said we'd like to make a public art piece. And I'd been thinking about these ideas for a while, so I went to them with that idea, and we called it First Fire. I called it First Fire because it was for First Night, but it sort of suggested that there should be more fires. And after Second Fire, we decided we had a naming problem, and it was actually Sandor Boda who came up with the name of WaterFire. So it grew very organically out of a wish to make a statement that might resonate with the entire community about the future. So the references were very literal about Phoenix rising from the ashes and the power of light to inspire people. And I think if we'd thought about the larger scale of the project, we never would have done it. It was the community coming back to us when we lit it for the sculpture conference, actually. You were talking earlier about that. That was in 96, because we first lit it in 94. And Convergence asked us to do it for the sculpture conference, along with lots of other projects Convergence was doing. And we had many, many people, some of whom were in the room. I know Joan's in the room here, and said, I can't believe I'm in Providence. And this is something that we needed to keep rebuilding, and then slowly we just experimented with the concept.
And I watched the WaterFire video, and you talk about being one of the top 10 spectacles to see in the
Well,
world?
we were
or
rated
top-
as that. Yes, we didn't make that rating.
Top-
But yeah, there was. We were rated as one of the top 10 spectacles to see in the world after dark, and we discovered that Paris was number 8, Providence was number 4. So.
So let's look at AS220.
Okay.
So.
Okay, go ahead.
So I just want you to fill in the blanks here. What were the critical challenges in terms of, and this is 3 different spaces, right? At AS220
Correct.
at this point. So the challenges of how you make this happen, key lessons learned that you want to share with others. And, people you all know about each other's work. So not just Bert has to talk here.
Okay. Could we click through? Aren't there more slides, or are we just using this one?
There was just one image.
Okay, there's one image. So you're only seeing one of our 3 buildings, all of which represent about $25 million of investment in the city, 3 derelict buildings that help define what we call the art cultural district in downtown. I think it's important, most important to understand that buildings are brick and mortar. Content, what happens in those buildings is what's most important. And what are the underlying values that are supporting the mission or supporting the activities of that organization? So once you're confirmed in what those values are, and that was out of the box with us. Some fundamental values, the belief that every person is born creative with a need to express themselves and sort of process this grand mystery in some way or another, was a fundamental belief. And that there should be opportunity for any and every person to be able to sort of evolve and develop that part of them. Of course, what really happens is we go to public school, or we go to school, and then they repress it. Because before public school, or before school, we live it as infants and as children. But then something happens after that. So I think there's that underlying belief. And also that, particularly during the 80s when we were commodifying artists at this incredible rate and making superstars and rock stars out of artists, somehow in the process we lost the intrinsic value of what artists bring and what art is really about. In terms of being some sort of a conscience to culture and to society, a shaper of art, of culture and society, a place where we sort of exercise our muscles in terms of our freedoms. What happens if we don't exercise those things, those muscles? We lose them. And I think the artists are sort of the avant-garde of really making sure that we're exercising those muscles, So, and I think somehow we lost track of that value added in terms of what artists and what art process and what artists communing with the community brings, okay? So I think in terms of challenges going forward in terms of our work, you don't have enough time. You don't have enough time to hear me bouncing somebody on their head out the door when we were in an illegal, unheated building, and I couldn't call the cops because we had a heavy metal show and some kid was getting out of hand. You don't have the time to hear the how right now. All the way up to being an organization that's a nonprofit with 7 for-profit corporations underneath it and doing some of the most complicated development deals imaginable at any scale. Okay? We don't have time for that. But what I do want to reemphasize and then let it go is the idea that what are you building on? What's the foundation? And that translates into a few terms that you're all extremely familiar with. That's the values, the missions, the vision, and also policy and practice. When I go out of town to speak, people will, and I will end, but someday. But when I go out of town, people have already done their research if I'm speaking out of town. They know the mission, they know the programming, they know that. But what the practitioners want to hear is, come on, unjuried, uncensored, are you kidding me? How do you really do that? And that's the practice. That's where the rubber hits the ground. And is the practice really supporting or resonant with the values that you express. And that's a really important place.
One thing that I would add to the list that Bert just went down that I think factored into the steel yard when we were building it was an additional, I guess, thing to keep in mind, which is context. And so being aware of your mission, your values, your practice, and all these things, but also being aware of your surroundings, too. And something that was really important to me when I first started out was not to be redundant, to be complementary, and to try, as competitive a world it is that we live in, it was really about understanding what the city had in its strengths and doing kind of an external, I guess, community audit in terms of strengths and weaknesses or, services already being provided versus what wasn't there. And we felt that industrial arts was something that wasn't there. ASU 20 had an extremely strong 2D visual art, music, basically the bulk of the rest of the output. But there was something that I felt wasn't yet there. And so I think to have a clear idea of what it is that you're doing and what you want to be doing, but also to make sure that there's a fit for what it is you want to do where you are. And so it's not just, I think that all of us have probably encountered the push to replicate in some form or to cut and paste our organizations in other cities. And I've seen some organizations succeed at it. I've also seen some organizations crash and burn. And I think some of it is because the context isn't necessarily taken into account, and the things that are trying to be brought in don't necessarily mesh with the ingredients that are already in that city. And so I think that's one thing that Barnaby really spoke to in his lead-in for Lynne, is that all of us kind of responded to something we felt wasn't necessarily here yet. And I think that's kind of the way that we try to approach what it is we do. We look around and look for the holes and try to fill them with good, fertile, creative ideas. And at least that's the way I think of myself as a community organizer or developer, is really what doesn't exist here already. I don't want to just, as Bert's talking about brick and mortar, I love building. I love constructing things. But if I don't have a good program to put in there, why build a ghost? There's no point. So, that's just my context spiel.
Did you want to add anything else about the steel yard in terms of things that were left out that were an important part of the story?
And I think that the other thing that Barnaby says in terms of knowing where it was going or how challenging it was going to be to get to where it is today was actually a benefit. I think, I kept on adding, I kind of only had a 3 to 5 year plan, which turned out to be a 10 to 13 now. And I think at 22, when I first started talking to Bert about the idea, had I known, I was looking down the barrel of a decade and 2 kids later, and living next door to the steel yard and the mill that I converted. And, I don't know. I think I would have probably hightailed it on out. It would have terrified me. Although I have to say, I'm really glad. And I think, again, it was a real benefit to have no idea. Naivete has some really positive outcomes, So the steel yard, I think, itself is, I'm happy to talk to anybody about it in more detail after this, but it is. I think it would be. It's just I'm not very good right now. I'm underslept, to tell you the truth. My baby girl is keeping me up, so I'm having a hard time being succinct. But I'm happy to talk to you about it in more specifics later, if you like.
And I think this issue of tenacity also applies to Lynne's work. And if you want to just flip forward, so. Lynne, I'm gonna say something before you speak for yourself, which is that Lynne, you may not know that she's an artist. She's a photographer, but she always was really interested in student government. You ran for student president in high school.
I was student council president.
So she's combined this interest in both art and politics, and survived how many mayors now?
4.
4 mayors, and it's just this really savvy political leadership, and able to see these opportunities and get people on the hook with immense community buy-in, so that you can then leverage opportunities as they come on down the line. So she's a great cheerleader for the city of Providence, but as is befitting of her role, she doesn't toot her own horn that much. But she's really, I think, the unsung hero of a lot of the stuff behind the scenes and what makes Providence.
Mayors come and go. Lynne sticks around.
Thank you.
The mayor's not here, correct?
I'm also, no, he's not.
So now you can retract
I'm also really bad at saying thank you for very nice compliments. Thank you. I was actually going to make Bert even more upset by saying that I graduated from RISD, from Rhode Island School of Design, in 1987. I remember as a student walking into the downtown core on a Saturday afternoon to go shopping at Woolworths. And I grew up in the city of Boston, so cities are where I feel comfortable and where I want to be. And I walked into the downtown, and the only thing standing between me and Woolworths was a police car. And the policeman said, "What are you doing down here, girl? You need to go back up the hill." And that's what Providence was in 1983, in 1985, in 1987. It was a city that had really fallen into the depths of urban decay. And I was fortunate enough, and I think something Bert also mentioned was it was at a time when artists were rock stars. And when I went to RISD, I made a very intentional choice to put all of that politics, the student leadership, the government, being a leader, I put it in a box and I said, I'm going to be an artist now. And it came back to bite me because it wasn't possible for me to just be an artist. But I reacted very strongly against the whole rock star, show in New York. You have to do these things to be an artist. And I started to become engaged in this community as a student. And I worked in the schools. I looked for opportunities to work with local artists. I started working with an artist named Bob Rizzo, who happened to also then be the director of cultural affairs for the city a few years later. And we started doing crazy performance art together. And when I was about 20 years old, I was performing at AS220 when it first opened in the non-juried space, smearing mud all over myself and doing all kinds of crazy things. Also, Barnaby and I worked together on a video show back then. Right. So I think that the point that I'm trying to make here is that we've all been at this working together for a long time. And I think that the interesting thing about what's happened in Providence is that we really were starting with a blank canvas, or a canvas that had just fallen into decay. And I think I was talking last night with some folks about, Rhode Island and Providence was the center of the Industrial Revolution. It was the richest city at one point in the early 20th century on the East Coast, and that's including New York and Boston. Per capita, it was the most wealthy city. And all of that fell away during the Depression and then during the post-war years, and people fled the city and didn't come back. And so there was all of this industrial waste sitting, waiting to be recaptured. And I think that, particularly when I think about what the Steel Yard has done, it really has been built on this organic matter that was sitting for a long time, needing to be re-energized and planted in, right?
It costs a lot of money.
But I think that in terms of the work that I've been able to do, it really is it's a cultivation. So I'm sort of very privileged to be in a position working with an incredible community of artists and arts organizations and community members who understand the way this works. And I am sort of in the cultivation. I'm the gardener, and I get to cultivate all of these great organizations and build these partnerships. And because I have this sort of innate sort of sense of politics, my grandfathers both worked for the city of Boston. One of them was the superintendent of the DPW, and the other one worked in the DPW. My father was an architect. So I come from a family, and many of my cousins were firemen and policemen. And so I come from a place of civic leadership and civic engagement. And wanting to serve the public. So I couldn't put that in a box. It didn't work. It came back, and I somehow ended up here doing this amazing work. And it's just such a privilege to be able to work in this community.
And you also studied film, which is
And
a
I studied film,
collaborative.
yeah. And we made rituals. And so
exactly,
I came to the work of city government through the whole idea of building ritual and building festival. And that's why the slide is up, because that's my passion.
And the mud
and you know, all that stuff. But,
And actually,
I remember.
But I think that's also important in terms of the way I approach the policy work, because when we did the cultural plan, we made it an event, and we made it something you could not ignore. It wasn't an activity that was behind the scenes. It was an event. So there's a whole story there too. But,
and in the previous panel too, I just wanted to out Gulgun as a theater artist. So you see these people taking leadership in director of arts, culture, tourism, creative economy positions, and the ways in which their background really informs their practice. Treating cultural the planning process as an event, and that whole crafting. It's interesting. So if you have questions you want to ask, feel free. We'll have a roving mic. Kip has his hand up over here.
I'll just shout until it gets here. I was here in Providence for 10 years of this 3 decades. And when I was living in Newport and Providence, at one point my wife turned to me and said, there should be a bumper sticker for the state of Rhode Island. I said, Marilyn, what would that be? And she said, I know a guy. And so there's this kind of incredible irony in that you all are sort of the classic examples of animating democracy. I mean, that's the thread throughout this. The WaterFire is this incredible democratic experience, all people, all ages, all races, all incomes, in a collective act of group contemplation. It's an amazing thing. And the work that AS220 does and the Steel Yard are both, like you said, Bert, the expression of freedom, and that sort of ripples through a community. So how is it, and it's changed since then, but when this was incubating, you had this, I know a guy, civic culture, which is poisonous. How was it that you had this expression of democracy through art? Walk us through that peculiar irony.
I'm a little confused about the question, but I'll tell you right now, Kip, if I didn't know a few guys, we would have never been able to do what we did. Our building didn't have electricity running, water running, heating running. I'm being completely frank with you. We would have never been able to pass an inspection to get the electric turned on. I knew a guy. And I'm not exaggerating this. And they happen to have a vol at the end of their name. You can interpret that. If you know the history of Providence, you'll understand what that means. And so I think there were pros and cons to the kind of intimacy and the kind of accessibility that there was here. Some people played it better and some people played it worse. In my case, I grew up working class. People say, where do you come from? I say, take some of the dirt out there on the street and add water. I've been roaming these streets since I was 11 years old. So, on my own, right? So, I think depending upon the scale of your city or where you come from, they all have their sort of pros and cons on how you get things, on how you might manage to get things done. For me, part of the motivation was sheer desperation. Because all of us in this room as cultural workers, and in particular those that are makers, we have such a drive to be engaged in community. Not just part of a community, but engaged in community. And this town was so desperate. And there was such a disconnect between people and artists, even, But yet we, as people who are conscious, crave community. So we created it, And as a result, we crossed paths. And then it became stronger and stronger as a result of our interaction and relationships. And we don't always get along, by the way, And if I could take one 30 seconds more and characterize that in terms of the cultural work that we're all engaged in. I think, and this may be a terrible analogy, but I think, having been to Cuba, I look at the people in Cuba who are extremely hospitable, and I used this example the other day, and then by nature, because of socio-political conditions and economic conditions, they're driven to behave in certain ways that is really not even their nature in terms of trying to hustle and see what they can get from situations. And frankly, I think the cultural milieu right now in this city, in this state, and in this country is very similar. I think that artists and cultural workers are forced to compete for minimal resources, that social political conditions is sort of pressuring us into behaviors that are actually not natural to us. Our nature is to be accommodating, hospitable, and cooperative, and collaborative. And yet, because of social, political, and economic conditions, we're being pressed into behaviors that are really not even natural to us. And we all in this room have actually challenged each other at different points about these kinds of issues between us. You feel like I'm competing? Are we competing? Or is that, oh my God, and all this, and that's not us. That's conditions, So
But I've always seen that as very constructive, though.
Huh?
I mean, our discussions.
I agree, and I think it's great, but it's in some ways to me it's inefficient. Like it would be much better if we were continuing to talk about the potential of collaborations and that these things were resourced in the way that they merit. Damn it! And I'm not apologizing for that expectation. You all know, we know that the kinds of tax breaks and all of this other subsidy that corporations are given, and they're fickle, they're not loyal, right? So I don't want to hear this bullshit that we're out looking for a handout or anything that, because the give back and what's produced, the product, is unbelievable, So I'll stop.
Kip, one more thing, though. When we knew a guy, though, it usually was a fellow artist. We didn't know any guys up high who had any sort of power. So it was very much this collaborative, democratic thing at the bottom. Oh, okay.
I said I did.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, all right.
But Kip raises a good point, which is, in my research on Providence, I've sort of pinpointed a few characteristics about this city that aren't necessarily the same in every other context. And one of this is this tendency towards civitas, that perhaps because of its roots founded by Roger Williams and religious tolerance, there is this interest in working together for the greater good, being open to newcomers. Folks can come in, and also you spoke to this a little bit, I believe, or maybe it was Barnaby, but a culture in government of we don't immediately say no. We might say maybe, let's try, let's see. Okay, let's try one fire and see how that goes. So there are some special characteristics that are in place that can help you do your work. And then also just the built environment and how walkable it is. And so I'm wondering if you have any insights into ways in which people from other communities that may not have those conditions in place can sort of accomplish similar achievements.
I mean, I would go back to the community audit type thing, where essentially it's about pinpointing, I think, and acknowledging the innovators and the creative people in the public sector, in the government, because we are lucky. I mean, I sat down with the head of traffic engineering 2 weeks ago, and all of a sudden realized that I had way more things to talk to him about than I thought I did when I first sat down. And we sat and took about an hour and a half just brainstorming about, there's this, some of you probably know the artist Gordon Matta Clark and his Odd Lots projects in the 70s in New York, where he'd find kind of these very strangely kind of slivers of property that, either nobody owned or the city owned or something. And, there's one of these, I think, outside of the building that I live, where it at some point got turned into this, curving, high-speed curve when it used to be part of the building. Anyway, so I was just thinking maybe we could, I started talking to him, started thinking maybe we could find more of these and get more property into people's hands so that it create more taxes for the city, because maybe some really neat things could kind of come out of it. But the fact that I'm sitting there with the head of traffic engineering brainstorming this on a Friday morning is pretty cool. I mean, I have to say that it's kind of amazing that I think if you just put the ideas out there, you may be surprised, obviously, or I think you will be surprised by how many times people actually respond with authentic curiosity and enthusiasm, partially because it's such a break from the other stuff that they have to deal with every day. Right. So I think just actually asking, and even if it sounds like a crazy idea, like starting a houseboat community in the river, where they want to put the pedestrian bridge, throw it out there. Maybe somebody will pick it up and be like, hey, that's a cool idea. So anybody wants to do that, just talk to me afterwards. We'll make that happen.
We have a question in the audience there.
So I talked to Barnaby about this yesterday. I just mentioned it, and it's really weighing on my mind. And then Kip said this wonderful phrase that WaterFire is a collective act of group contemplation. I've been thinking about this art as a democratic act, and as art really happening not in the object, but in the space between the object or the spectacle and the viewer. And what kills me about WaterFire, which I never really realized, is the importance and the role of the volunteer. And I think that as co-collaborators, they kind of really give a beautiful example of this idea of free will and exchange. A lot of artists, what we want is free, that kind of sentiment. But then if you think about how many WaterFire spectacles there's been over how many years and how many volunteers, could you just talk about that? Because that blows me away. And I don't know of any other, I was talking to Liz Keith, I was like, do you know of anything else that's like this? Because I think the volunteers having a role. So in the creative placemaking definitions, you have engage, active engagement, participants, audience, but the idea of the person having a role as a co-creator it just kills me. I don't know what else to say, so I just want to know more.
The volunteers deserve a tremendous thanks and appreciation, so thank you for saying that. And the idea where that came from was that almost everyone in the city is a creator of some sort and has something to give, but we don't often give people an opportunity to do that sort of creative act. So when we ask for volunteers, we're not necessarily asking them to tear tickets at the door or sweep up afterwards, although there's plenty of those things people do. But we try to empower them to actually make them captains. If they don't know how to drive a boat, we train them to be captains, and we train them to be interactive agents, because not just the volunteers, but the audience itself we see as part of the fabric of the entire artwork. So that I don't think of water as what we're working with, or fire or firewood. I think of people and the social space and their interactions throughout the city, ranging from the policemen to the volunteers to the audience, all as being one part of the whole of the artwork. So the volunteers are an extremely important part of that. And we have volunteers, there's some in this room, who've worked for 18 years for WaterFire. And that's weekend after weekend. And there's I encourage you to go up to some of the volunteers here and ask them about what the motivation is. But I think we all want to make the world to be a better place. And it's rare that we have the opportunity to do that with the comradeship and fellowship. I mean, there are lots of other organizations like that. I mean, I think of the house building projects and things like that. People really enjoy working together to make a transformatory experience. Mm-hmm. And part of our mission is to build capacity for that to happen. That happens at all of these organizations. It certainly happens at Steelyard and at AS220. And we find that almost everyone is willing to step forward and do that. And just be acknowledged for that.
You looked like you had pushback there.
No, I don't have pushback. I'm just thinking, and I'm thinking about the work over the last 20 years, and the volunteers are a great example of building that civic engagement through art. And I think that's to Kip's point about democracy. But I also think that this city was a hellhole. No one wanted to be here. It was a depressing place. And the people who stuck it out, the philanthropists who stayed, the people who were still living here, there was a lot of healing that needed to be done and a lot of building that needed to be done. And the reason I stayed here was because I saw the potential of making a city rebuilding a city, making a city for the 21st century, and that was exciting to me. But Jack's got this public art review issue out on healing arts, and I think that so much of the work that everyone in this room does is about healing through the arts, and it can be something like what Laura talked about this morning with the big the project that was upsetting the community, and the artists came in and helped keep that healthy, kept those businesses healthy by interacting with people. And I think that's what all three of these organizations have done for 20 years is think about how does art give a touch point for an interaction with a city. How does it change someone's lives? I mean, we haven't even talked about the work that Bert does at the training school with our incarcerated youth that is just mind-blowing. Every single one of these organizations is healing the people who live here, healing the city. And I think that the role, and I feel like city government has been healing as well. We were, an incredibly corrupt place, and we've been healing for 12 years. We've been trying to heal this up. And I don't want to underestimate the power that this work has in that regard.
I just want to segue from that point because that's an incredibly powerful outcome that I would imagine may be hard to measure. So I want you to all think about the overarching frame of this conference, measuring, evaluating, and communicating impact. So are there ways in which you address that in your own practice? Anything you're struggling with, or any successes that you can share with others in the room? Silence.
I wish funders weren't so paranoid. Measurements and indicators and how many 15 different words. I mean, we know intuitively through the participation of people if it's succeeding or it isn't. We all do. Every one of us do. And yes, I think there's some level of accountability that we all have to sort of take responsibility for to some level or another. How do you measure hope in a community? Right. I think if I could segue in a little bit and riff a little bit off one of the tangents, artists are the ones who always find value where other people don't. We opened up a print shop and we had the etching press and the litho press and the silk screening. And guess what the two most popular programs we have is our offset printing and our letter presses. Because offset presses and letter presses are sitting in garages because they don't want to give up their grandfather's press to the trash, right? And now artists are saying, oh my God, I can do multiples of my book on that offset press. I want to take that class. And suddenly all these machines are being repurposed. We find it in buildings that have been abandoned. We find it in the trash on the street, okay? And what happens and what snowballs from that? We're seeing it happen in Detroit. We saw it happen in Pittsburgh. And we're going to continue to see it over and over again in the most desperate places. I spent time in Christchurch that was leveled by earthquakes. There's a group of artists over there that are doing interventions in Christchurch that could bring tears to my eyes if I even spoke 2 sentences to the work, okay? And then that snowballs. And it begins to create a sense of hope and possibility, Again, I'm not trying to sort of avoid responsibility for quantifying and qualifying this stuff, but on the other side of it, come on. There's more evidence than can possibly be processed.
And Gulgun wants to speak to that point.
I think so I'm going to share with you an example in Minneapolis. So you were asking how to measure hope. We have an art project in Minneapolis called the Minneapolis Interactive Macro Mood Installation that actually aggregates online data through tweets and Facebook posts within the vicinity of the city that then reflects it back in colors on a inflatable tethered sculpture in the plaza of the convention center. And the actual project is called the Creative City Challenge. It's a temporary art project. The project was developed by a team from Harvard and Minneapolis, intentionally to reflect the identity and feelings of the city. It was a piece that was kicked around in the mayor's race this year, so we saw it being dissed to some degree. But it did have a lot of impact in that it allowed us to collectively look at how we feel, and talk about it. And so the important part was the dialogue, really, about why should we care and what does identity really mean. And it's a temporary project, so every year we can have the same discussion. But its intention was to do exactly what you're saying. It's to collectively value the idea of feeling as a important point in our community, not just hard data. So,
I think that another interesting thing in this field of creative placemaking and art place grants and kind of the desire for quantifiable impact is there's value to it. But when discussing and advocating for the power of creativity and art, innovation, and design, you'd think that you'd want to reflect it in such a way that it actually mirrors the things that you're advocating for. And in my mind, we all have an appetite for aesthetic, visual, well-designed objects and material. So this may be a very small aspect, but why aren't the documents recording these things better looking? I mean, honestly, like, why is the NEA, I mean, God bless whoever's here from them. I'm a big fan, absolutely, hello. But at the same time, like, man, there's an opportunity, mix it up. Get some kind of exciting designers working on your material.
The NEA has just recently launched a new website, which looks very nice.
Excellent. Well, I'm sorry. I've been in a newborn hole of kind of isolation recently, so I apologize on that front. But I mean, it's a tricky balance because I am a philanthropist as well as community organizer and developer, and so I do understand the importance of quantifiable data and whatnot. But for me, a lot of people are driven by emotion, and like you say, Bert, you know it. I mean, when you see it, you know it, and you know it's working. And so I think there just has to be a better, I think, more narrative efforts getting these stories out there. My wife and I do a publication yearly that look at, it's called Outpost Journal, and our first one was on Pittsburgh. The second one was on Baltimore. Last year was on Kansas City, and this year I'm proud to say is going to be on Providence. And it looks at the creative scene across the board, and it's, I believe, a well-designed piece that really kind of looks at a lot of the different arts and organizations happening in that city. So it's kind of like, how do we get that word out there more? We got to tell these stories so that other cities can see their own potential to create things that are already within their fabric, just to bring them to the surface and possibly rethink how they're packaging them.
I think that organic kind of stuff that we're talking about that artists really bring when they see opportunity, and when the story, as it evolves and things build upon that story gets lost. People tend to forget that, people in Detroit now are looking a blind eye as artists are occupying buildings and making stuff happen. People tend to forget that really is the origin of that rebirth or that reimagining or that revitalization, whatever terms you want to use or whatever the new urbanists want to say or whatever vocabulary they apply. That story gets forgotten. But I can promise you that every rebirth, at that moment, artists were involved, were engaged, and highly responsible for helping people to be able to reimagine and to provide the kind of hope and possibility that it takes to turn a city, as described by Lynne, that is what it is today. And I really welcome you to tour around and see what has happened in the last 25 to 30 years.
And I just want to challenge us to be careful about that narrative, which I agree is, you said people forget, but I actually think that narrative of artists as the urban pioneers that discover a down and out wasteland and suddenly attract new value is very much presented in the media. But just remember that oftentimes, you may not value it, you may not see it, but there can be populations that were living there before. There can be pockets of industry. It might not be, a manufacturing hub, but small scale manufacturing. So we have to just be mindful of not sort of overly valorizing the arts in a way that diminishes what was there concurrently and you know.
And I know we have a question in the back, and I think we need to get to this fine gentleman who's been waiting and another person. But what we talked about last couple weeks ago with the Rudy Bruner thing was this steel yard, and there was a working steel yard there for 100 years, and it was going to be closing soon because the family was going to retire, and the way that, and I wish I had told the story earlier, but the way that Clay and his partners approached that project was with every, with the utmost care in terms of respecting the past and honoring what had happened there and making sure that they were part of the change. And I think that is one of the things that goes on in this community and goes on in all of your communities when artists are involved. And I think it's different when it's a developer changing a building that used to da-da-da. I mean, it's different. I think when we, and back to the measurement thing, I mean, AS220 did the building on Empire Street after moving twice before that. The city helped get that off the ground. And when we had another building down the street that needed the same kind of care, we went to AS220 as a developer and said, you guys are the only ones who are going to be crazy enough to be able to do this and figure it out. And so that was a measure of their success in that first building, and then they did a third building. So, I know I said a really snarky remark in the last panel about data because I live with mayors and they only are in place for 4 or 5 years, sometimes longer, but they want to see results. They want to see people. They want to see. I mean, Mayor Taveras. Whenever I went with him to WaterFire that first summer, he was like, I had no idea there were this many people. Oh, my God, This is beautiful. I understand this. Look at our whole cities here. This is very healing. And he just went through this iteration, all of these things. And that's the result I need to keep this moving. So anyway.
So let's get to a few more questions.
Yeah, I just
one
wanted
more
to
thing.
make
You asked for take-home lessons, and there were a couple here that I just want to enunciate for people, which is one is this idea of temporary. You can try it. Let's see if it works, then we'll try it. And going to artists as resources, and the sense when artists go in respectfully into conversations, we're creative problem solvers. And I've found, and both of you said the same thing, the city responds very positively to people coming with new ideas and new perspectives. And just to encourage people not to be scared of that. And I know we had some questions.
I just wanted to make a comment. People have been asking, is there documentation of results? Do we have any proof of it? And this is somewhat of a segue, but I produced a show called Fixing the Human Machine for 7 years. And I did a lot of research and interviewed a lot of doctors. And we were talking about the value of community. And it's more than just jobs and what it does for people. There was one study in particular that I think is very relevant to what community does to people. There was a town in Italy where almost everyone in the town emigrated to the United States. Some of them were isolated. Some of them stayed in the same community in a city. They followed the health of those people over the entire lifetime. They all had the same habits. They all had the same eating habits, smoking, drinking, whatever. The people that were isolated and did not remain in community and preserve their culture they didn't recover from illness as fast. They didn't live as long. They didn't have as good a quality of life. The people who preserved their community had far greater longevity, far quicker recovery from illness, and an overall better life quality. And that's a medical study, right? It doesn't seem to have anything to do with the arts. Yet I think it very clearly indicates the value of community in every inch and level of our lives. And I think art's a huge part of that, too. So if you want documentation, there's actually medical research that will back up the value of community.
Good to know.
Hi, this panel is awesome. I wanted to share an observation. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I wanted to share an observation and then pose a question to the panel. It's very exciting that we've moved the discussion towards indicators and measurement because this is the overarching topic of the conference. And I totally understand the that I can intuit, I can feel the difference with our work that we've done, and engagement and conversations and ongoing stories with residents, and therefore kind of like push aside the report that I have to do, or design a way to sort of gather this data in order to churn it out. And it's hard. Laura talked about how she had millions of stories that she could share, but only had to sort of boil it down to something that translated to numbers. And so indicators, the observation or something that I just wanted to share was that indicators exist primarily for me to sort of show the success of our projects and share the process with others who want to replicate it. And then second, to prove to others who aren't in this room that we can, that we deserve the money or grant, And so that proving, I think, data really has to prove a success at some capacity to share with others who don't understand. Lynne talked about how a whole community had to educate a mayor in order for him to articulate the value in the work that the Providence Arts and Culture, Arts, Culture, and Tourism was doing for the city. So I would like to ask you to share a medium or a conversation you had with someone that you had to prove to, and instead of a document or numbers, what was it that you used to prove, or like what sort of
Change
stories?
hearts and minds, right?
Yeah.
What's that?
Change hearts and minds.
Yeah. So I wanted to just have you reflect on that and share an anecdote. Thank you.
I have a really, really simple, clear answer to that one example. One of our city councilmen was a newly elected city councilman, very, I would say, parochial and a real ward politician type guy. And I thought, my God, I don't know how I'm ever going to work with this guy. He doesn't get it. He's not an arts guy. He wants baseball bats in all his kids' hands so that they can play baseball, and that really seems to be all he cares about. We have a neighborhood performing arts series, and it engages our parks community groups in a really, really wonderful way, and I could do a whole story on just that. But I moved the opera that was on Federal Hill, which is our Italian neighborhood, and it was outgrowing the space. I moved the opera to his neighborhood, to a park that had been completely underutilized, was really not clean, was in the middle of an incredibly busy intersection, but it was in the center of his ward, and invited him to come. And he came, and within the first 4 weeks, he was already asking me, when is it coming back? Because his constituents wanted that there. They saw the power. It was bringing all of the neighborhood market people together to sell goods, and his senior citizens out to enjoy something on a Sunday afternoon. And throughout the years, he's become one of our biggest allies. And when we went to try to get the money for the WaterFire building just recently, he was one of the people who was saying, yes, we need to do this. 5 years before, he would have said, what, are you crazy? So just the simple act of engaging him in the work, and I had to say maybe I was being a little manipulative, but it served him. It served his needs. He cared deeply about his community, and they were, so that's just a very clear, easy example.
Now, I'd like to reinforce that. Don't tell them, show them.
That's what I was just saying. Just have them come to any one of the 4 programs that are here, and they speak for themselves.
And have Kleenexes so they can wipe up the tears after they're so moved by the experience that they have. I'm not kidding.
No,
so we don't have a lot of time left, and I would love to get 1 or 2 more questions out.
Jason.
Hi, it's Jason Schubach from the National Endowment for the Arts. Thanks
Hi,
for picking
Jason.
on us. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
I'm here for the federal government, and I'm here to help. Why is that funny? This is more of a pitch to come to my speech tomorrow than a comment. Excuse me as I hijack your panel. A couple things that we're going to talk about tomorrow. Myself and the research director from the NEA will be coming in tomorrow. One, we're going to preview our beautifully designed storybook project, which will be on our website, which will have 75 case studies and lessons learned about creative placemaking projects from across the country. And the emphasis there was access to information and beautiful design and easy to understand, because people have been asking us for stories. And the other thing we're going to talk about is about our viewpoint on evaluation and data points in our little data project. The number one lesson that I hope everyone gets, if you're not there tomorrow, so I can say it now, is We believe very strongly you need to have a professional evaluator associated with your project to really understand what happens in something. There are no shortcuts with data. You've got to have someone on your team who understands actually how to evaluate a project. And that's really the big message we want to send out. We feel like there's been a little bit of the lesson that we learned is that the data is hard to understand, is something hard to track over time, and we do not want arts people to become data wonks. You should be doing art. So, so stick around for a little preview of that tomorrow. It'll be even wonkier than what I just said. And if you want to nerd out with us tomorrow, 2 o'clock.
I'm a fan of the Cultural Data Project, as painful as it is. Sorry, I am.
No, that's beautiful.
Yeah, good. Thanks.
Just in response to Jason, as a grantee of the Our Town project, and with so many partners and so many different projects we've had. I know I thumbed my nose at data a little while ago, and I said it already, but I'm like so hungry. We did not have a professional evaluator on a project, and we missed so many. And we're going to go back and try to do it forensically. But I want to be able to talk about all those wonderful things that happened in a really deep and meaningful way that includes data and includes perception shifts. So I know, Ann.
Gotcha.
While I am still focused on political leadership and they don't need as much, I do think it's a really important thing, and I look forward to working with Jason's projects.
But this is a science. Yeah. I mean, data and making sense of it and capturing these things, it's a science. That is not really our expertise, per se.
Right.
A little capacity help around some of this stuff.
I think for Providence, that's a really frustrating thing because we are not a big city. We don't have big foundations. We have one community foundation. It's the 7th largest in the country. We have representation here from that foundation. They do what they can to help us, but we just don't have access to as much money to help us with this kind of stuff. And it's very frustrating I think Bert and I in particular, because we know we are doing amazing things and we can't really talk about it the way we'd like to. So,
ladies and gentlemen, our time is now up. Please join me in a warm round of applause for all of our panelists.